I came home on a Thursday afternoon to find my hedges gone. Not trimmed, not shaped. Gone, 14 years of growth, cut to the ground, stumps and sawdust, where a 7-foot privacy hedge had stood that morning when I left for work. My neighbor was standing at her fence line with gardening gloves on and the specific expression of a person who has done something they intend to justify. She said the hedges had been overhanging her property and she had exercised her right to trim them. I looked at what she had done and I looked at her and I said 3 words. "You'll regret this." She laughed. What she did not know was that I am a licensed structural engineer with 30 years of experience, that I had been planning this wall for 2 months, that I had already pulled the permits, and that there is not a single thing in the HOA bylaws, the municipal code, or the laws of this state that can stop a property owner from building a perfectly legal cinder block wall on their own land. By the time I was done, she would be looking at 8 feet of solid concrete and mortar every single day for the rest of her life in that house. Stay with me. My name is Jonathan Hale, and I have owned my home at 22 Birchwood Drive for 17 years. The house sits on a generous lot, nearly 1/3 of an acre, in a neighborhood that was developed in the late 80s, and that has the particular settled quality of a place where most of the trees and plantings have had decades to mature into something worth looking at. My yard, in particular, had benefited from the attention of the previous owners, who had been serious gardeners, and from my own sustained interest in the property over the years. When I bought the house, the hedges along the eastern property line were already 6 years old and approximately 4 feet tall. By the time of the events I am about to describe, they were 14 years older, roughly 7 feet tall, and had been shaped by my careful seasonal trimming into a dense, even screen that provided complete privacy along that boundary, absorbed road noise from the adjacent street, and had become, in the estimation of every neighbor and visitor who ever commented on them, one of the more impressive natural features of the block. They were English boxwood, the large-leaf variety, planted in a continuous row of 22 individual plants spaced 18 inches apart. If you know English boxwood, you know that they grow slowly and that this slowness is part of their value. You cannot replace a 14-year-old boxwood hedge with a new planting and expect the same result in anything less than a decade of careful cultivation. What took 14 years to grow can be destroyed in an afternoon with a chainsaw. My neighbor had used both an afternoon and a chainsaw. Her name was Pamela Ostrowski, and she had moved in next door approximately 3 years before the destruction of my hedges. She had purchased the property from a couple named the Hendersons, who had been quiet and entirely pleasant neighbors for 11 years and whose departure I had genuinely regretted. Pamela arrived with a moving truck, a white sedan, and a set of opinions about the neighborhood that she began sharing within her first week at a pace and volume that made clear she had strong views about how things should be and was not going to be quiet about it. Her first grievance with me was the hedges themselves, which she raised approximately a month after moving in. She came to my door on a Saturday morning and told me that the hedges along our shared property line were blocking her light. I asked her what light she meant specifically. She said the morning light to her kitchen windows, which faced east toward my property. I went and looked at the geometry, and I confirmed that the hedges, at 7 feet, did reduce the direct morning sunlight reaching her kitchen windows, because my property was to the east of hers, and the hedges ran along the boundary. I also confirmed that the hedges were entirely on my property, set back approximately 18 inches from the boundary line, and that the light they affected was light crossing from my land to hers, which is not something I had any legal obligation to manage on her behalf. I explained this politely. She said the hedges were a nuisance. I said they were a legal planting on my property. She said she would look into her options. I said she was welcome to do that, and I closed my door. She did look into her options. The HOA was her first stop. The Birchwood Drive neighborhood had a homeowners association that was run at the time by a man named Bill Forsyth, who had been president for 6 years and who I had found consistently reasonable during our interactions. Pamela filed a complaint with the HOA citing the hedges as a visual obstruction and requesting that I be required to reduce their height. Bill called me to let me know the complaint had been filed, which I appreciated, and told me the board would review it at their next meeting. I attended that meeting and provided documentation that the hedges were within my property line, within the permitted height for plantings in a residential zone under the municipal code, and predated Pamela's ownership of her property by 14 years. The board found no violation and declined to act. Pamela's second stop was the Municipal Code Enforcement Office. She filed a complaint there as well, citing the hedges as a code violation. The code enforcement officer, a woman named Linda who had been doing this job for 15 years, came out and looked at the hedges and looked at my property survey and told Pamela that the hedges were not in violation of any applicable code and that the matter was closed. Pamela told Linda that the hedges were reducing her property value. Linda told Pamela that property value assessments were not within code enforcement's jurisdiction. Pamela told Linda she would be filing an appeal. Linda told her the appeal process was available and provided the relevant form. The appeal went nowhere. I know because Bill Forsyth called me to let me know, and because Linda's supervisor called me as a courtesy to inform me that the original finding had been upheld and the matter was administratively closed. That was 2 years before Pamela cut the hedges. In the intervening 2 years, she filed 3 more HOA complaints, which the board dismissed each time, and 2 more code enforcement complaints, which were similarly closed. She had pursued every available official avenue, and all of them had told her the same thing, which was that the hedges were legal on my property and not subject to her preferences regardless of how strongly she held them. I had documented every one of these proceedings, every complaint, every response, every letter, every dismissal. I had a file that was thick and well organized, and that my attorney, a woman named Carol Brennan, who had handled property disputes for 20 years, had reviewed and described as unusually thorough. Carol had told me after the second round of HOA complaints that the situation had the characteristics of a harassment pattern, and that if Pamela escalated to any physical action affecting my property, I should contact her immediately. I called Carol at 4:47 p.m. on the Thursday Pamela cut the hedges. Carol told me to document the damage extensively before touching anything. I spent 40 minutes photographing and videoing the entire hedgerow, the stumps, the debris, the chainsaw cuts, the precise line of destruction. I photographed Pamela's property line to establish that the cuts were clearly on my side of the boundary. I photographed the pile of cut material on my lawn, which Pamela had not attempted to remove or return to her own property. I called the city's non-emergency line and reported the property damage and requested that an officer come and document the scene. An officer came within 2 hours, took my statement and photographs, and created an incident report. Carol filed a civil complaint the following morning citing destruction of property and seeking damages that addressed the replacement cost of 22 mature English boxwood plants, which George Whitfield, the certified arborist I had been using for 11 years, assessed at approximately $900 per plant plus installation, for a total hedge replacement cost of just under $20,000. The complaint also sought damages for the diminution in property privacy and aesthetic value during the period until a replacement hedge reached comparable maturity, which George estimated at 12 to 15 years. Carol described this element of the damages calculation with a precision that she told me would be difficult for any defendant to dismiss, because it was based on documented horticultural standards rather than subjective preference. Pamela's claim that she had been exercising her right to trim branches overhanging her property was the defense she offered when Carol's complaint reached her attorney. This defense has a basis in law. Property owners in most states do have the right to trim branches or roots of a neighboring tree or hedge that encroach over their property line, up to the property line, at their own expense and without compensation to the neighbor. This is a real legal principle, and it was the one Pamela intended to rely on. What her attorney discovered when he reviewed the documentation Carol provided was that Pamela had not trimmed branches overhanging her property. She had cut the hedges to the ground on my side of the property line. The photographic record was unambiguous. The stumps were 18 inches inside my property boundary. The cuts were not selective removal of overhanging material. They were systematic destruction of the entire hedge at the root level. The trim your neighbor's overhanging branches right does not extend to entering a neighbor's property and cutting their plants to the ground. What Pamela had done was not a legal trim. It was trespass and destruction of property. Her attorney, to his credit, appeared to have explained this to her clearly, because her response to the civil complaint shifted relatively quickly from confident assertion of her trimming rights to a more subdued position involving offers to discuss a resolution. Carol told me this was a good sign and that we should let the process run while I pursued my other plan. My other plan was the wall. I want to explain the wall in the context it deserves, because people hear cinder block wall and they think of something crude or punitive, and that is not what I built. What I built was a structure that I designed myself using 30 years of structural engineering experience that met every applicable building code requirement, that was constructed with a quality of materials and workmanship that I was professionally proud of, and that accomplished, in permanent masonry, exactly what the Hedges had accomplished in living plant material, which was complete privacy along my eastern property line. I had been thinking about the wall for 2 months before Pamela cut the hedges, not because I had anticipated the destruction specifically, but because 2 years of watching her pursue every available avenue to force a change to my property had given me a clear picture of what kind of neighbor she was and what the future of living next to her was likely to involve. The Hedges, for all their beauty and maturity, were living things that could be damaged, diseased, or, as it turned out, deliberately destroyed. A properly engineered masonry wall was none of those things. It was permanent, maintenance-free along my property, and subject to no biological vulnerabilities. It was also, under the municipal code and the HOA's governing documents, entirely permissible. I had checked this carefully before I allowed myself to become attached to the idea. The municipal code permitted solid masonry fences up to 8 feet in height on residential properties in my zone. The HOA's architectural guidelines, which I had reviewed line by line, required pre-approval for fence installations, but specified no prohibition on masonry materials and no height restriction below the municipal code's limit. The property line setback for fences was 0, meaning the wall could run exactly on the property line, which was what I intended. I had submitted the pre-approval application to the HOA's Architectural Review Committee 6 weeks before Pamela cut the hedges. The application included a detailed engineering drawing, material specifications, and a site plan. Bill Forsyth had called me when he received it and asked if everything was all right. I told him I was exercising my property rights and that the application was complete and in compliance with all applicable requirements. He said he would take it to the committee. The committee approved it. There was no legitimate basis to deny it. The design was code compliant, the materials were appropriate, and the application was complete. I received the written approval 2 weeks before Pamela's chainsaw afternoon. I had also pulled the building permit from the city, which was required for a masonry structure over a certain height. The permit was issued without issue. I had the engineering drawings, the approvals, and the permit all in order before the destruction occurred, which meant that when I called the wall contractor the evening after Carol filed the civil complaint, I was calling to schedule a start date, not to begin a process. The contractor was a man named Ruddy Vasquez who had worked with me on 3 previous projects and who, when I described the wall I wanted, said he could have a crew there by the following Monday. I told him Monday was fine. The wall went up in 11 days. It was 8 feet of reinforced concrete masonry units, finished on my side with a smooth stucco coat that I had painted a warm cream color, which complemented the exterior of my house and which several neighbors stopped to admire during construction. On Pamela's side, it was the standard gray block finish, which is not unattractive but is plainly what it is, which is a wall. I want to describe the process of watching it go up, because it was one of the more satisfying experiences of my professional life, and I think it deserves description. Ruddy's crew arrived Monday morning and began with the footing excavation, which they completed in a day. Tuesday was the footing pour. Wednesday through Friday was the first course of block, leveled with a precision that I checked personally each evening because I am an engineer and I cannot watch masonry go up without checking the levels. Over the weekend, Ruddy's crew worked Saturday only and got through the second course. The following week was the remaining courses, the reinforcement, the bond beam at the top, and the stucco application on my side. By the second Wednesday, the wall was at its full height. I stood in my backyard and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a structure built correctly to specification, with proper materials and sound technique. 8 feet of solid masonry running the full length of my eastern property line, from the rear of my house to the back property corner, 112 feet of it. Pamela, whose kitchen windows faced east, could no longer see my property from inside her house. She also, and I want to be precise about this, could not see her own property particularly well from certain angles because the wall's height, combined with the proximity of her house to our shared boundary, meant that what she looked out at from her eastern windows was now 8 feet of concrete block in standard grey finish. She called the HOA the day the wall reached full height. I know because Bill called me the same afternoon, not as a complaint notice, but as a courtesy, the way he had always operated, to let me know she had contacted them. He said she was demanding the wall be required to come down. I told him the wall had been built with HOA pre-approval and a city building permit and was in full compliance with every applicable standard. Bill said he was aware of that and that the committee's approval was documented and that he would be communicating this to Pamela. He said, with the dry brevity of a man who had been dealing with Pamela's complaints for 2 years, that he did not anticipate the board taking any action. He was correct. Pamela's attorney contacted Carol 2 days after the wall reached full height. He was inquiring about the civil suit and whether a settlement discussion might be productive. Carol told me she interpreted the timing as not coincidental. When you add the wall to the civil complaint with its $20,000 damages calculation and the municipal building inspector's documented approval and the HOA's documented approval, the picture available to Pamela's attorney was a property dispute that his client had started, lost through official channels, escalated through property destruction, and was now going to pay for in a variety of simultaneous ways with no avenue of relief available. The wall, in particular, was something he could not fix. It was legal, it was built, it was not coming down. The settlement negotiation was straightforward in the way that negotiations are straightforward when one side has a very strong position and the other side has a decision to make. Pamela settled the civil complaint for an amount that addressed the hedge replacement cost, the arborist assessment fees, Carol's fees from the duration of the conflict, and a documented acknowledgement of the trespass and property destruction. The amount was not trivial. It reflected the full cost of what she had done and the full period during which she had pursued her campaign through official channels before taking matters into her own hands. Carol sent me the executed settlement agreement on a Friday afternoon. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and then I went out to the backyard and I stood next to my wall. The stucco was fully cured and the cream paint had 2 coats on it, and in the afternoon light it looked exactly as I had intended it to look, which was like a permanent, well-built architectural feature of a well-maintained property. I put my hand on it. It was solid and cool and smooth. It was exactly what it was designed to be, which was something that would last. My neighbor on the other side, a retired teacher named Frank, who had watched the entire situation develop, with the patient attention of a man with nothing more pressing to do, came over that evening with a bottle of wine to what he called a wall warming. He said it was the best fence he had ever seen, and that he hoped she enjoyed looking at it every morning for the rest of her life in that house. I poured 2 glasses, and we sat on my back patio in the evening air, and I told him I felt the same way. Pamela has not spoken to me since the settlement. This is not a hardship. We have been neighbors for 3 years since the wall went up, and the arrangement has been entirely satisfactory, which is to say that we live on adjacent properties and conduct our lives without interaction or interference. She looks at my wall, I look at my yard. The world continues. The HOA, for its part, has functioned exactly as a homeowners association is supposed to function, which is as a neutral body that applies its rules consistently and does not become anyone's instrument of preference. Bill Forsyth is still president. He has still not found a violation on my property. I think we understand each other. The wall is 7 years old now. The stucco is still sound, the paint has been refreshed once, and the structural integrity is exactly what the engineering drawings specified, which was designed for a service life of at least 50 years with standard maintenance. The boxwood hedge that Pamela destroyed has been replaced, not along the property line where the wall now stands, but along the back of my property where it faces my own garden and serves no function except to be beautiful, which is a sufficient function for a plant. I think about the hedges sometimes. 14 years of slow growth, the particular patience that a gardener applies to plants that will not hurry regardless of how much you want them to. I had tended those hedges through 14 winters and 14 summers, and the destruction of them took an afternoon. There is a version of this story where that loss is the tragedy of it. But the version I actually lived is the one where the loss clarified exactly what I needed to do and gave me the legal foundation to do it permanently. She removed 14 years of slow organic growth from my property line. I replaced it with 50 years of reinforced concrete. I am an engineer. I know which material wins. She destroyed 14 years of my hedges. I replaced them with something she can never touch. My neighbor on the western side, a retired civil servant named Frank Olson, had watched the full 2 years of Pamela's campaign with the patient attention of a man who has seen enough of human nature not to be surprised by it, but who still finds it interesting. Frank had been on the block for 22 years, longer than anyone, and he had a particular gift for observing neighborhood dynamics with the calm clarity of someone who has no stake in the outcome. He told me after the second round of code enforcement complaints that in his experience, the kind of sustained official harassment Pamela was conducting generally ended one of two ways. Either the person got bored and stopped, he said, or they convinced themselves that the official channels had failed them and that direct action was the answer. He said the second outcome was more common than people expected, because the kind of personality that pursues something this persistently through official channels is generally not the kind of personality that accepts the official channels saying no. Frank was right. He usually was about people. What I found most instructive about Pamela's behavior during those 2 years was not the complaints themselves, but the way she escalated each one. The first HOA complaint was polite and procedural, the filing of a person who believes the system will work in her favor. The second, filed after the first was dismissed, was more pointed in its language and cited provisions that did not actually apply to my situation, which suggested she had been reading the HOA bylaws and finding things she thought she could use rather than things that actually fit. The code enforcement complaints followed the same pattern, starting from a general allegation and then, after each dismissal, refiling with more specific language, citing different code sections, adding new characterizations of the alleged violation. She was not a stupid person. She was applying genuine effort and intelligence to a campaign that the underlying legal reality could not support regardless of how intelligently it was pursued. I documented all of it. I documented not just the official filings and responses, but the texture of them, the shifts in language, the escalating specificity, the pattern of being told no and refiling with a new angle. Carol Brennan reviewed the file at 6-month intervals and told me each time that it was building into one of the more thorough records of sustained neighbor harassment she had encountered. I told her I found the process of building it clarifying. She asked what I meant. I told her that documenting a situation carefully over time forces you to see it as a sequence of decisions made by a specific person, rather than as a cloud of conflict, and that seeing it that way made it easier to anticipate what came next. She said that was a very engineering way of looking at a neighbor dispute. I said I was an engineer, and that was how I looked at most things. The building permit process was interesting in its own right. I had applied to the city's building department for the masonry fence permit with the same completeness. I brought to every application full engineering drawings, site plan, material schedule, footing design, reinforcement specifications. The permit examiner was a young man who clearly had not reviewed many residential masonry fence applications and who spent considerable time with my drawings before calling me with 2 questions, both of which were technical and both of which I answered in a follow-up submission within 24 hours. The permit was issued the following week. The examiner noted in the approval letter that the engineering was thorough, which I took as a professional compliment and which I noted in my file because I noted everything in my file. I did not tell Pamela the wall was coming. I had no obligation to inform her of a legal improvement to my own property, and while I would not describe my decision not to mention it as strategic, I will acknowledge that I was not unhappy about the prospect of her discovering it when the crew arrived on Monday morning. What I was told later by Frank, who observed the scene from his front window, was that Pamela came out of her house at approximately 8 in the morning when Ruddy's truck pulled up, walked to the edge of her property, looked at the equipment and the materials, and stood there for a long moment before going back inside. Frank said she did not look like a person who was surprised. She looked like a person who had understood something she had been trying not to understand. I found this description satisfying in a way that I did not feel the need to examine too closely. The 11 days of construction were, in some ways, the most peaceful 11 days I had experienced in 2 years of living next to Pamela Ostrowski. The work was physical and visible and progressing, and it produced a daily result that was measurable and concrete, literally concrete, and I found the evening inspections restorative in a way that I had not fully anticipated. I would come home, walk the length of the wall as it had developed that day, check the courses with a level, look at the reinforcement schedule at the corner zones, and feel the particular satisfaction of a professional seeing work done correctly. The wall was not a complicated structure from an engineering standpoint. It was straightforward masonry with a competent contractor and good materials. But there is a satisfaction in straightforward work, done well, that is different from the satisfaction of solving a difficult problem. And in the months I had been dealing with the official complaints and the civil suit and the settlement negotiations, straightforward work done well was exactly what I needed. Ruddy's crew was good. I have worked with a lot of contractors over 30 years, and the quality of a crew shows in the small things, the way they treat the site, the care they take with the layout, the attention to the details that nobody will ever see but that determine whether a structure performs as designed over its service life. The block joints were consistent. The courses were plumb. The corner work was clean. I watched them work each evening, and I found nothing to correct, which is the highest praise I know how to give a masonry crew. By the final week, when the bond beam was poured and the stucco was going on, several neighbors had stopped by to look at the wall in progress. Most of them were complimentary. Mrs. Patterson from across the street said it gave the block a distinguished character, which I thought was generous but not inaccurate. Alan, my neighbor from 2 doors down, who had received one of the HOA's enhancement notices in Phil's first year, said it was the most useful fence he had ever seen and asked for Ruddy's number. The retired teacher Dorothy from the corner lot said the cream color was elegant, which I appreciated because I had spent some time with color samples before choosing it. Nobody asked me why I was building it, which I interpreted as everyone in the neighborhood knowing exactly why I was building it. The morning after the wall was complete, I stood at my kitchen window with coffee and looked at the eastern yard, which was transformed. The wall caught the early light, and the cream surface was warm and solid, and it made the yard feel defined in a way it had not been before, bounded on the east by something permanent and decided. I am a structural engineer. I think about how structures shape the experience of space, about how a wall creates enclosure and enclosure creates a particular quality of attention, the way a room focuses you differently than an open field does. My eastern yard, which for 17 years had been defined by the organic uncertainty of a growing hedge, was now defined by masonry. The quality of the space was different. It was quieter and more deliberate, and I found I liked it better than I had expected to. I did not see Pamela that morning. Her kitchen windows faced the wall, and if she was standing at them, she was looking at 8 feet of gray concrete block, which is a specific and permanent view that I had provided her with at my own expense and on my own property and within the full authority of every applicable law. I hope, in whatever way she processes these things, that she thinks about the hedges every time she looks at it. I think that is a reasonable thing to hope. The settlement, when it came, was exactly what the situation merited. The amount addressed the hedge assessment in full, the arborist costs, Carol's fees from the entire 2-year period, and the written acknowledgement. Carol told me the acknowledgement had been the sticking point in the final negotiation, that Pamela's attorney had tried 3 times to substitute softer language, and that Carol had held the line each time. I was glad she had. The document that Pamela signed states plainly, in language that cannot be interpreted another way, that she entered my property without permission and destroyed my plantings. It is in my file between the settlement agreement and the final building inspection report for the wall. The file is complete. The situation is resolved. The wall will be there when everyone involved in this story is gone from this neighborhood. I rebuilt the boxwood hedge along the rear boundary of my property the spring after the settlement, 16 plants in the same variety, same spacing, same careful initial shaping that will guide them into the form I want over the coming years. They are 4 years old now and 3 feet tall and doing exactly what young English boxwood does, which is growing slowly and surely toward something worth waiting for. In 16 years, they will be a hedge. In 20, they will be magnificent. I will not be here to see them at their best, probably. I planted them anyway, because that is what you do with things that take time. You put them in the ground, and you tend them, and you trust the process, and you do not let anyone with a chainsaw near them.